fifth grade, Mrs. Pecora here. Here's my puppy sitting next to me, sleeping on the couch. So if you hear a little bit of snoring, know that it's coming from him. I promise it's not coming from me. So bear with me as I get this set up. I wanted to show you my puppy so you didn't think I was lying when I said there was snoring and it was him. But anyway, so in our story, hold on one second while I get this set up. Okay, in our story, the little boy had poured that in. He forgot he was in plain view, and he was spinning around like a trapeze artist in the kitchen, and the chef threw the knife, cut his tail, and then he escaped. So let's see if he gets back out into the dining room and back to Grandmama. So here we go. Let me make sure this is lined up. Okay, there we go. I had to get out of the kitchen and back to my grandmother. There was only one way to do this. I must make a dash clear across the floor and out through the door behind one of the waiters. I stayed quite still, watching for my chance. My tail was hurting terribly. I curled it round so as to have a look at it. About 2 inches of it were missing, and it was bleeding quite a lot. There was a waiter loading up with a batch of plates full of pink ice cream. He held a plate in each hand, and 2 more bounced on his arm. He went towards the door. He pushed it open with his shoulders. I leapt out of the sack of potatoes and went across that kitchen floor and into the dining room like a streak of light, and didn't stop running until I was underneath my grandmother's table. It was lovely to see my grandmother's feet again in those old-fashioned black shoes with their straps unbuttoned. I shimmied up one of her legs and landed on her lap. "Hello, Grandmama," I said. "I'm back. I did it. I poured it into their soup." Her hand came down and caressed me. "Well done, my darling," she whispered back. "Well done, you. They're at this very moment eating the soup." Suddenly she withdrew her hand. "You're bleeding," she whispered. "My darling, what's happened to you?" "One of the cooks cut off my tail with a carving knife," I whispered back. "It hurts like Billy-O." "Let me look at it," she said. She bent her head and examined my tail. "You poor little thing," she whispered. "I'm going to bandage it up with my handkerchief. That will stop the bleeding." She fished a small lace-edged handkerchief out of her bag, and this she somehow managed to wrap around the end of my tail. "You'll be all right now," she said. "Just try to forget about it. Did you really manage to pour the whole bottle into their soup?" "Every drop," I said. "Do you think you can put me where I can watch them?" "Yes," she answered. "My handbag is on your own empty chair beside me. I'm going to pop you in there now, and you can peep out as long as you are careful not to be seen. Bruno is there as well, but take no notice of him. I gave him a roti, and that's keeping him busy for a while." Her hand closed around me, and I was lifted off her lap and transferred to the handbag. "Hello, Bruno," I said. "This is a great roll," he said, nibbling away in the bottom of the bag, "but I wish there was butter on it." I peered over the top of the handbag. I could see the witches quite clearly, sitting at their 2 long tables in the center of the room. They had finished their soup now, and the waiters were clearing away their plates. My grandmother had lit one of her disgusting black cigars and was puffing smoke over everything. All around us, the summer holiday guests in this rather grand hotel were babbling away and tucking into their suppers. About half of them were old people with walking sticks, but there were also plenty of families with a husband, wife, and several children. They were all well-to-do people. You had to be if you wanted to stay in the Hotel Magnificent. "That's her, Grandmama," I whispered. "That's the Grand High Witch." "I know," my grandmother whispered back. "She's the tiny one in the black, sitting at the head of the nearest table." "She could kill you," I whispered. "She could kill anyone in this room with her white-hot sparks." "Look out," my grandmother whispered. "The waiter is coming." I popped down out of sight, and I heard William saying, "Your roast lamb, madame. And which vegetable would you like, peas or carrots?" "Carrots, please," my grandmother said, "but no potatoes." I heard the carrots being dished out. There was a pause. Then my grandmother's voice was whispering, "It's all right. He's gone." I popped my head up again. "Surely no one will notice my little head sticking out like this," I whispered. "No," she said. "I don't suppose they will. My problem is I've got to talk with you without moving my lips." "You're doing beautifully," I said. "I counted the witches," she said. "There aren't nearly as many as you thought. You were guessing, weren't you, when you said 200? It just seemed like 200, I said. I was wrong, too, my grandmother said. I thought there were a lot more witches than this in England. How many are there? I asked. 84, she said. There were 85, I said, but one of them got fried. At that moment, I caught sight of Mr. Jenkins, Bruno's father, heading straight for our table. Look out, Grandmama, I whispered. Here comes Bruno's father. Mr. Jenkins and his son. Sorry, boys and girls. Mrs. McClure's allergies are killing her today. All right, here we go. Mr. Jenkins came striding up to our table with a very purposeful look on his face. Where is that grandson of yours? He said to my grandmother. He spoke rudely and looked very angry. My grandmother put on her frostiest look but didn't answer him. My guess is that he and my son Bruno are up to some devilment, Mr. Jenkins went on. Bruno hasn't turned up for his supper, and it takes a lot for that boy to miss supper. I must admit he has a very healthy appetite, my grandmother said. My feeling is that you're in illness as well, Mr. Jenkins said. I don't know who the devil you are, and I don't care much, but you played a nasty trick on me and my wife this afternoon. You put a dirty little mouse on the table. That makes me think all three of you are up to something. So if you know where Bruno is hiding, kindly tell me at once. That was no trick I played on you, my grandmother said. The mouse I tried to give you was your own little boy, Bruno. I was being kind to you. I was trying to restore him to the Bosman's family. You refused to take him in. What the blazes do you mean, madam? Shouted Mr. Jenkins. My son isn't a mouse. His black mustache was jumping up and down like crazy as he spoke. Come on, woman, where is he? Out with it. The family at the nearest table to us had stopped eating and were staring at Mr. Jenkins. My grandmother sat there puffing away calmly on her black cigar. I can well understand your anger, Mr. Jenkins, she said, and any other English fathers would just be as cross as you are. But over in Norway, where I come from, we are quite used to these sort of happenings. We have learned to accept them as part of everyday life. You must be mad, woman, cried Mr. Jenkins. Where is my Bruno? If you don't tell me at once, I shall summon the police. Bruno is a mouse, my grandmother said, calm as ever. He most certainly is not a mouse, shouted Mr. Jenkins. Oh, yes, I am, Bruno said, poking his head up out of the handbag. Mr. Jenkins leapt about 3 feet into the air. Hi, Dad, said Bruno. He had a silly sort of mousy grin on his face. Mr. Jenkins' mouth dropped open so wide I could see the gold fillings in his back teeth. Don't worry, Dad, Bruno went on. It's not as bad as that, just as long as the cat doesn't get me. Bruno, stammered Mr. Jenkins. No more school, said Bruno, grinning a broad mouse grin, and no more homework. I shall live in the kitchen cupboard and feast on raisins and honey. But, Bruno, stammered Mr. Jenkins. How did this happen? The poor man had no wind left in his sails at all. Witches, my grandmother said. The witches did it. I can't have a mouse for a son, shrieked Mr. Jenkins. You've got one, my grandmother said. Be nice to him, Mr. Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins will go crazy, yelled Mr. Jenkins. She can't stand these things. She'll just have to get used to him, my grandmother said. I hope you don't keep a cat in the house. We do, cried Mr. Jenkins. Topsy is my wife's favorite creature. Then you'll have to get rid of Topsy, my grandmother said. Your son is more important than your cat. He certainly is, Bruno shouted from inside the handbag. You tell Mom she's got to get rid of Topsy before I go home. By now, half the dining room was watching our little group. Knives and forks and spoons had been put down, and all over the place heads were turning round to stare at Mr. Jenkins as he stood there spluttering and shouted. They couldn't see either Bruno or me, and they were wondering what all the fuss was about. By the way, my grandmother said, would you like to know who did this to him? There was a mischievous little smile on her face, and I can see that she was about to get Mr. Jenkins into trouble. Who? He cried. Who did it? That woman over there, my grandmother said. The small one in the black dress at the head of the long table. She's RSPCC, cried Mr. Jenkins. She's the chairwoman. No, she's not, my grandmother said. She is the grand high witch of all the world. You mean she did it, that skinny little woman over there? Shouted Mr. Jenkins, pointing at her with the long finger. By gad, I'll have my lawyers on her for this. I'll make her pay through the nose. I wouldn't do anything rash, my grandmother said to him. The woman has magic powers. She might decide to turn you into something even smaller than a mouse. A cockroach, perhaps. Turn me into a cockroach, shouted Mr. Jenkins, puffing out his chest. I'd like to see her try. He swung around and started marching across the dining room table towards the Grand High Witch's table. My grandmother and I watched him. Bruno had jumped onto our table and was watching his father. Practically everyone in the dining room was watching Mr. Jenkins now. I stayed where I was, peeping out of my grandmother's handbag. I thought it might be wiser to stay put. All right, boys and girls, stay tuned for tomorrow, and we'll see what happens to Mr. Jenkins. I hope he doesn't get turned into a cockroach. Bye-bye.